A resurfaced video shows Liberal Leader Mark Carney saying that Canada will have to adjust to a market where access will depend on the amount of carbon in goods and services.
A Liberal candidate has apologized after calling for a Conservative opponent to be turned into Chinese authorities for a bounty.
An anti-gun activist with a history of calling for stricter gun laws will be running as a Liberal candidate in Quebec. Hello Canada, it's Monday, March 31st, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Isaac Lamoureux.
And I'm Noah Jarvis.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. Despite lowering the consumer portion of the carbon tax, Liberal leader Mark Carney has emphasized that the amount of carbon in any goods, services, or exports will soon be a determining factor in whether they have access to the free market. Carney made these comments during an online discussion last June, hosted by the Century Initiative and the Globe and Mail. The discussion focused on the future of net zero policies as some governments have signaled shifting priorities. During the panel, Carney went on to say that the future of trade in Canada will soon be crucially dependent on the amount of carbon in a good and a service that is exported. Carney said, quote, "It is going to become in a much more difficult trading environment, and that's what we're entering, and we're entering it for decades. The amount of carbon in a good and a service and in an export." The host of the panel was deputy editor of the Globe and Mail, Dennis Choquette. Choquette said, quote, "We've seen lately a lot of backlash to some of the climate policies. The consumer carbon tax in Canada, I think it's fair to say, is vulnerable. I think this week in New York, the governor walked back on a congestion charge quite dramatically. Investors have pulled out $40 billion from ESG funds this year because of concerns about a lack of performance." Carney said that the $40 billion figure may sound like a, quote, big number, but that it's absolutely tiny in the grand scheme of things regarding the net zero transition. Carney said he believes carbon will be the significant factor in whether or not you have market access. Carney recently lowered the consumer portion of the carbon tax to zero. However, his critics have pointed out that Canada's federal carbon pricing law is still in effect, and also the industrial carbon tax remains in effect. Carney would later acknowledge this during an interview with CBC's Rosemary Barton last month, claiming that any added cost would only be a, quote, marginal amount. So, Noah, what else has Mark Carney said about his views on net zero and carbon pricing?
Well, Mark Carney has been a staunch advocate of the net zero agenda for many years. During his time, living in the United Kingdom, he was the head of COP26, one of the big climate change conferences that global leaders all fly in on their private jets to talk about what they need to do to bring emissions down to net zero, and then they go and build another coal-fired plant. But Carney has been very big on the idea that global emissions need to reach net zero by 2050 so that we prevent catastrophe and calamity. And to do that, he has been a very big believer in carbon taxes, which might be surprising to some Canadian voters, as one of the first actions that he took was lowering the consumer carbon tax to zero, calling it a policy that Canadians no longer support. However, in his book Values, Mr. Carney said that politicians who abandon carbon taxes should be held accountable. He said that backtracking on climate agendas should be difficult for politicians, and that if they do backtrack on these climate agendas, they should be held accountable. So Mark Carney has walked back the Liberal government's climate agenda, their flagship policy of a consumer carbon tax that would drive up the price of all things that produce carbon emissions, and in turn emitting carbon emissions that much more undesirable. However, the Canadian economy is structured around emitting carbon, as is all other advanced economies, especially if you look at the Albertan economy that is heavily reliant and receives a lot of its wealth and bounty from the oil and natural gas sector, where there is plenty of untapped potential underneath the feet of Albertans. So Mark Carney has sent some very contradictory statements about carbon emissions and just the fight against quote unquote climate change, Mark Carney really hasn't been questioned by the legacy media about his past positions on carbon emissions, whether the what he has said in his book Values, or what he has said as the climate envoy for the United Nations, or what he said this past June. So it remains to be seen whether or not a prime minister, Carney-led government would overturn the reduction of the consumer carbon tax to zero. That is a concern that conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has brought up to the Canadian media, and I think it is a concern that a lot of Canadians have because these contradictory statements really make it hard to understand where the Prime Minister stands on a very important issue. An explosive report by the Toronto Association for Democracy in China alleges that Liberal incumbent candidate Paul Chiang called for a conservative candidate to be returned to Communist China for a bounty. The report has prompted condemnation online, including from Conservative MP and candidate Michael Chong. Chiang is running for re-election in Markham Unionville and was quoted in a Chinese language media outlet allegedly suggesting that somebody, quote, can claim the $1 million bounty if a conservative candidate, Joe Tay, is brought to Toronto's Chinese consulate. National security experts, opposition figures, and anti-CCP Canadians have condemned the alleged comments. Chiang allegedly made the comments to the CCP-funded Hong Kong-based outlet Ming Pao. Tay, a candidate running in Don Valley West, has been a vocal critic of the Chinese Communist Party, and reports have indicated the Chinese authorities have placed a bounty on Tay to be captured. The bounty, reportedly worth $1 million Hong Kong dollars, has been issued by the CCP-influenced Hong Kong authorities, although no further details have been provided on the specific nature of the reward. This situation follows a series of allegations of foreign interference, particularly from China, which have come to light in recent years. Chong, the Conservative MP for Wellington Halton Hills, has been a staunch advocate in the fight against Chinese interference in Canadian democracy. He has long criticized the Liberals for what he perceives as their failure to act decisively in response to these threats. Chong commented, quote, "It's outrageous that after years of turning a blind eye to Chinese Communist Party foreign interference, warnings from experts, and a public inquiry, that the Liberals continue to play footsie with foreign interference, putting the security of Canadians at risk." Paul Chiang has since made a vague statement in regret of his comments, calling them a, quote, lapse of judgment. So, Isaac, the issue of foreign interference has been part of the mainstream Canadian discourse for a couple years now. We've seen allegations going back even to 2021 that the Chinese Communist Party had influenced certain ridings, the electoral outcomes in certain ridings in the 2021 election and the 2019 election. You have people like former Conservative MP Kenny Chu, who have stated that they were personally affected by Chinese foreign interference. Conservative MP Michael Chong was alerted by the Canadian Security and Intelligence Services that he was a target of Chinese foreign interference. And there are many other such cases. So, Isaac, after 9.5 years of Liberal governance, how have they handled the issue of Chinese interference in Canada's elections?
Well, yeah, no, if we take it back just one step before this upcoming general election, the Liberal Party of Canada leadership race, which evidently Mark Carney won, was actually subject to some backlash for not doing enough to combat foreign interference. Former Conservative Party of Canada Leadership Election Organizing Committee Chair Ian Brody formerly told True North that China's past meddling in the Liberal nomination was a concern and that something needed to change. He said, quote, "Yes, there are good reasons to worry about the Liberal rules. The party has done nothing to clean up the rules that allowed Chinese diplomats to bus Chinese students studying in Canada to Han Dong's nomination meeting. In fact, they seem to think this is a model for how Liberal decisions should be made." CSIS sources and documents claim that Liberal MP Han Dong received assistance from the Chinese consulate in Toronto during his 2019 nomination race. And we remember users on X showing how easy it was to register to vote in that leadership election using fake addresses, fake names, and so on. As for the Conservatives, former leader Aaron O'Toole claimed that up to 9 of his candidates suffered defeats due to a misinformation campaign masterminded by China. Former Conservative MP Kenny Chiu, who accused the Liberals of ignoring election interference, explained that demographics are segregated in how they receive information, and that it is too easy for foreign actors to expose this. He provided an example saying if Putin wanted to control Canada's Russian population, Chu said, quote, all they would have to do is buy out the media and then pump this information to these diaspora communities that use Russian social media. This is what I observe to be the case in Canada, and it is still ongoing. And of course, China is the same with using WeChat, and we've seen that brought up in various hearings. Chiu tabled a bill to create a public registry for anyone working with hostile regimes. Conservative MP Michael Chong similarly called for a foreign agent registry to be created, but that has still not happened. The Liberals did table a Countering Foreign Interference Act in May 2024, which itself caught backlash for being tabled just before the Foreign Interference Commission's Justice Mary Jose Hogue could table her final report on the matter. And despite a previous report from the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians showing that elected officials were engaging in political interference, notably for China and India, Hogue said that nobody acted in bad faith. In fact, she disagreed with much of the previous report. So it's not entirely clear what's going on, especially since she said there are no names, but various political leaders have said the opposite. Natalie Provost, an anti-gun activist who wants to see the Liberals adopt even harsher measures against law-abiding firearms owners, is now a Liberal candidate in Quebec. Provost is a survivor of the 1989 École Polytechnique attack, which claimed 14 innocent lives. Notably, Liberal leader Mark Carney recently mistook Concordia University as the school where the attack took place, but he later apologized after backlash. In her role as an activist, Provost has been accused of spreading misinformation about firearm ownership. In a Radio Canada interview, Provost presented a fictional rifle she labeled KD-85 as fact. However, the image of the gun was a fabricated April Fool's joke spreading on Reddit. Radio Canada has since deleted the image containing Provost's blunder. Even following gun bans imposed by the Liberal government, Provost has made it clear that the government did not go far enough. Provost has been pushing for even more radical measures, including more extensive firearm bans and a wider reaching gun confiscation program. Her frustration with the Liberal government's approach led her to resign from a government panel in 2019. At the time, critics like the Canadian Coalition for Firearms Rights accused Provost of being unqualified and biased due to her lobbying activities. In her resignation letter, she called out the government's failure to tackle the problem head-on, accusing them of being too timid in their attempts to curb gun violence. The passage of Bill C-71, which she considered a half measure, failed to meet her expectations for stronger action. Bill C-71 was enacted in 2019 by the Liberal government, expanding background checks for non-restricted firearms. Critics argue that it's part of an overreaching gun grab effort by the government that unfairly targets law-abiding owners with a backdoor registry. But it wasn't just the failure of Bill C-71 that pushed Provost to leave the committee. It was the realization that the government was not willing to go as far as she thought necessary to curb gun violence. She argued that the gun buyback program, which is currently a central part of the Liberal government's gun control strategy, would do little to address the root causes of violence while costing taxpayers millions. And obviously, Noah, we've seen that the Liberals have waged war on law-abiding firearm owners, but the vast, vast, vast majority, in many instances, upwards of 90 or higher percentile of crimes are committed with illegal firearms. But how much has the gun buyback program cost Canadians?
Well, our good friends at the Canadian Taxpayer Federation asked this very question, and they discovered that the Liberal government, as of September 2024, spent at least $67 million on this gun buyback, with no firearms being collected at this point. Of that 67 million, approximately 11.5 million were spent on consultants who are probably just telling the Liberals how to, enact this gun buyback, clearly not giving them great advice because, as I previously mentioned, not one gun has been collected. And the guns that they are collecting are from law-abiding firearms owners who were vetted, who had to go through a process to receive their license, to be able to buy their gun, and whose guns are under strict regulatory controls. I mean, it's not like Canada is known for its permissive gun rules to begin with. We're not like the United States, where we have the Second Amendment that protects firearm owners in the Constitution. However, Canadian firearms owners were under the assumption that so long as they did what they were supposed to do, that they followed the rules, and that they weren't, taking these guns out and committing crimes with them, which by and large, Canadian firearms owners have met those commitments, that the government won't be confiscating their guns. And with this new Liberal candidate that the Liberals have appointed, Natalie Provost. I mean, I'm sure what she had to go through years ago was absolutely awful, but that does not justify taking away the private property of law-abiding citizens to solve a problem that is actually being caused by illegally obtained firearms. As you mentioned, Isaac, the vast majority of firearms that are used in crimes are illegally obtained firearms that are coming in from the United States. The Liberal government, they had no care whatsoever to stop the flow of illegal firearms in from the United States, potentially taking action to strengthen the border, and potentially even putting pressure on the American government to stop the flow of illegal firearms coming into the United States. There was no interest in doing that. The only interest that they did have was creating a wedge issue for the Conservative Party on the firearms issue. Most Canadians are supportive of firearms restrictions. However, this is under the assumption that many of these legal firearms are used in crimes as if they are in the United States. So I think that when Canadians discover that the vast majority of firearms that are used in crime are illegally obtained firearms, and once they are told that this gun buyback scheme costs already $67 million, more than likely more than $67 million by this point. It is March 31st. So it is probably in excess of $70 million, over $70 million spent on a measure that hasn't produced any results. And, for a misguided policy in and of itself, I think many Canadians are going to find that that is angering and would want a substantive policy change. Whether we're going to get that policy change remains to be seen. It seems as if the Liberal government is going to continue on the same path that they had under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And quite frankly, it looks like they're going to win the election if it is held today. Many things can happen in the election campaign, but if Canada does re-elect a Liberal government, I think firearms owners can expect the government to move forward with their confiscation scheme.
And just quickly, Noah, yeah, in the Liberals' most recent budget, they actually allocated an additional $597.9 million over the next 3 years in taxpayer monies to collect the guns. But of course, they still have not collected a single one. That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating and please leave a review.